Hello, my name is Ying-Syuan Huang. I'm a recent PhD graduate from McGill University, and today's presentation is actually my doctoral study. I would like to begin this presentation by bringing all of you back to the 1990s of Taiwan. At the time, Taiwan just became a democratic country. Therefore, there were a lot of social movement as well as environmental movement happening in the countries. Against this backdrop, in 1997, Taiwan's National Council of Sustainable Development was established. In 2004, the Council actually published Taiwan Agenda 21, which is highly similar to the UN Agenda 21. In 2011, Taiwan's Environmental Education Act was implemented, the EE Act. And this EE Act was actually considered as a milestone by the government because at the time, Taiwan was one of the few countries that enshrined environmental education into law. And because of its implementation, there are currently about 1/6 of the population is now required to take annual courses related to environmental sustainability or environmental education. Therefore, I was interested in understanding the development and implementation of Taiwan's ESD policies in general, as well as this very specific nationwide education policy, the EE Act. I was also interested in understanding how ESD has been mainstreamed into the National Sustainable Development Plan. So the study framework began with the current sustainability challenges. We actually require, in order to resolve them, we actually require a collaborative effort. This had led to several discourses, for example, the UN-led discourse of development goals or the current sustainable development goals. In education, similarly, UNESCO in 2005 actually called for the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, the ESD, which encouraged countries to reorient their teacher as well as K-12 curriculum to promote sustainable development through education. The Decade of ESD has also inspired development of Taiwan's Environmental Education Act, and because of its implementation, there are currently a number of policy implementers, or the educators, are actually moving around the country to teach those required annual courses. Therefore, these policy implementers are the determinant factors for the success or lack of success of Taiwan's ESD implementation. All these are working under the premise that if we do education or ESD well, we're able to help to contribute to the solution to these sustainability problems. Therefore, my study looked at 3 areas in this diagram. First, what is the political rationality of the government of Taiwan for adopting or responding to UNESCO's for the Decade of ESD? Second, how was the ESD policies or the EE Act being implemented? More importantly, I was interested in examining the outcomes and impacts of these initiatives. So specific overarching research questions are as follows. First, what government structures and mechanisms have the Taiwan government established to implement the EE Act? Second, in what ways and to what extent can a nationwide education policy contribute to the desired outcomes of the Act? Importantly, what lesson can we learn from the Taiwanese experience of developing and implementing UNESCO's framework of ESD? Policy ethnography is being used as a study research methodology. Policy ethnography is an emerging qualitative research methodology. It seeks to examine this iterated policy process from the standpoint of policy actors. And in my studies, these policy actors are the policy implementers. Following the policy are at the core for policy ethnographers. But what does that mean? So policy ethnography emerged from this phenomena that there are a number of education, social and environmental issues are actually emerged at this international or conference or summit or online conversation in education community. And these discourses are traveling at various scale and become different initiatives or policies that encourage people to address those issues or raise awareness of these issues. In my study, these at various scale, these institutions involve, for example, UN, IPCC, or UNESCO's Decade of ESD, and the discourse of ESD actually travel or trickle down at the national level. So EPA and Minister of Education are putting together policies to promote sustainable developments. These policies trickle down to the provincial level as well as the local level. For example, at schools, at public sectors, people are required to learn about these issues. Therefore, for policy ethnographers, following the policy means that to follow the people, to follow their ideas, their stories, their lives and conflicts, as well as to follow the resources, money, and power relations involved in different stages of policy making. For these studies, I collect various sources of data, which include policy texts, 2 rounds of semi-structured interviews with 30 policy implementers. For those who agreed to participate in the observation process, I also conducted participant observation with them. And then I carry out a follow-up interview with the 4 people that I observed. When I was in the field, I also collected various forms of artifacts. For example, lesson plans, internal reports, external reports of their publications, and also their online subscriptions to understand where are the information that they're taking or learning the new knowledge from. A hybrid process of inductive and deductive thematic analysis was being used to analyze all the data. So because of time, I'm only going to present some highlights of the findings, and which is structured in the following way. First, the political rationality of the government, and the government structure and implementation mechanism, and also the potential impacts and lessons learned. First key finding, political rationality. Through document analysis, I found that the government has strived to carve out a niche to become a leading nation and global partner of UN to achieve sustainable development goals. This was done because the government actually considered environmental diplomacy as a means to becoming an independent country. It also implies that the Taiwan government has a strong political interest in ensuring the success of Taiwan's ESD agenda. Therefore, to ensure effective implementation, the tactic of Chinese legalism seems to be used to implement Taiwan's ESD policies. And I'm not going to talk about the detail of what Chinese legalism is here, but as a broad definition, it is a pragmatic political philosophy aroused in ancient China to inform statecraft to ensure domestic stability. Second key finding, the government structures. Through document analysis as well as the observation and interviews, I found that the framework for ESD implementation in Taiwan is actually quite similar to what UNESCO is proposing. For example, the National Council of Sustainable Development was an overarching institution that oversees the national sustainable development policies as well as ESD policies. And because of the establishment of this council, there's actually a quite sustainable funding system for educational initiatives. The EE Act, actually also ensured the lifelong learning for sustainable development of the Taiwanese citizens, which these frameworks is quite similar to what is being described in the Global Action Program on ESD of 5 priority areas that's written by UNESCO. For example, transforming learning and training environment to enable the ESD implementations. And in Taiwan, similar initiatives, it's also happening. For example, there's actually a national structural system for certifying specific educators who can teach these annual required courses on environmental sustainability. The third key finding is related to the outcomes or potential impact. What I found was that despite the government's strong interest in ensuring its success, Taiwan's Environmental Education Act has generated limited enthusiasm for sustainable development. And after 8 years of implementation, it's even turning some policy implementers into skeptics. Through interviews, I found that some policy implementers feel that some education activities are actually not the solution to Taiwan's environmental challenges. Examples such as the school gardens or installing solar panels on the rooftop of the school buildings are actually way too small scales and addressing only individual behavioral change that we actually shying away from addressing the underlying drivers of unsustainable practice in society. In the interview, some educators or some policy implementers also share that the actual purpose of education seems to be lost due to this bureaucratic process of ESD implementation. Many of them are trying to follow the government's agenda and promote as many ESD activities as possible. However, they become swamped by this paperwork and evaluation forms and also publicity of these activities instead of really thinking about what are the actual meaningful purpose for these educational activities. Through observation, I also noticed that some of the public sectors and private sector has a very strong emphasis on showcasing positive outcomes. And some public sectors even use these ESD policies or implementation as a form of greenwashing exercise. Some lessons we can actually draw from this example are actually without critically reflecting on what to change, education doesn't seem to be that impactful because it actually can bring only limited desirable systemic change that is actually needed for sustainable development. And through the interview and observations, we also learned that more education does not necessarily mean that it will be more effective or better in driving changes. Some of the implementers became to notice that people start to resist and create sort of or feel overwhelmed by the information that's being given. And this phenomenon is quite well documented in the literature, environmental numbness, and which is occur when messages of environmental catastrophe are too often broadcast by the media, governments, or scientists, such as these messages are no longer being seen as news and consequently are ignored. And this phenomenon is also being found in my study because many of the colleagues of these policy implementers are too overwhelmed or too annoyed by annual courses and the topics that's being repeated annually, but without providing any actual actions or solution to solve the problem. I'm going to talk a few of the study implications that it's emerged from the data. First, for future studies, national motivation for promoting ESD are actually very important because they are not able to separate from the wider geopolitical interests of the country. Second, considering the policy context or political environment of Taiwan actually became used as a very unique context for future SDG studies for example, using the living lab approach to experiment different models of community sustainabilities because of sustainable funding and also a quite comprehensive ESD policy structure. And through my study, I also found that many of the policy implementers found that there are actually not that much common visions when we're talking about ESD. Therefore, future ESD agenda should focus more on the envisioning and the pathway for sustainable futures, while we're actually consider what are the reality ecological boundaries. From this study, there are a few articles that are currently in review or revision, and I thank you again for listening to my presentation. If there's any question, my email address is listing on the PowerPoint slides. Thank you.